Welcome, everybody. So glad to have you here today for our Honest Reporting Insider Briefing with our very distinguished guests, Professor Eugene Kontorovich and Arsen Ostrovsky. I want to get right into it, so I'll start just a little bit who Honest Reporting Canada is, and then we'll introduce our speakers, and then we're off to the races. So Honest Reporting Canada is an independent grassroots organization promoting fairness and accuracy in Canadian media coverage of Israel and the Middle East. With the assistance of over 45,000 members coast to coast, Honest Reporting Canada monitors the media, recognizing excellence and exposes inaccuracy and bias in Canadian reporting in the region. Today, we have a very special panel of two, as I mentioned, very distinguished panelists talking about Israel's legal rights to the region, specifically today with the political milieu, and we'll discuss that. So our first speaker, Arsen Ostrovsky, is a leading international human rights lawyer and Middle East foreign policy analyst based in Tel Aviv. 2 years ago, he was awarded the Nefesh B'Nefesh B'nai Zion Prize in Israel advocacy, while the Jewish Telegraph Agency named him one of the most 25 influential people on Jewish Twitter. You can follow him there at Ostrov_A. That's OSTROV_A. Our other speaker, Professor Eugene Kontorovich, is one of the world's preeminent experts on universal jurisdiction, maritime piracy, as well as international law and the Arab-Israeli conflict. He was a professor of law at Northwestern University from 2011 to 2018. And previously, he was a visiting professor at the University of Chicago. His expertise is often sought out by major news organizations such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, the Los Angeles Times, and his writing has also appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Political Commentary, Haaretz, and many other leading publications as well. So I really want to thank everyone for joining us and our speakers as well. So just a couple items, housekeeping items here. Let me fix my screen. Couple housekeeping items. You are unable to unmute yourselves for security reasons or to share your screen. If you do have any questions that you would like to ask, you can certainly email me, robert@honestreporting.ca. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and unmute our speakers, so just to make sure that they can do that. Let's see here. We want to make sure that. So I just want to hear our speakers. Sirs, are we able to hear you both?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Professor.
Loud and clear.
Wonderful. Excellent. Yeah. Perfect. So first of all, like I said, I want to thank you both for joining us. Let's just dive right in. Let's start with you, Arsen. Tell us a little bit about what you make of the recent peace agreement, or the recognition of the peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Israel is reported to be pausing its annexation plans. Tell us from a sort of a political viewpoint, is this just sort of Netanyahu using his cards very wisely, or is this something he was never going to do anyway and might as well get a peace deal with the UAE out of it?
That's a good question. First of all, thank you so much for having me on and all the amazing work you guys are doing. I would have been a little bit more properly attired, but it's something like 40 degrees here, and it's all fantastic that we have a peace deal with our friends from the Emiratis, but there are some things that they can keep with my utmost of respect for them. The weather is one of them, but it is a great pleasure to be on here, and especially with a professor, with Eugene. It's a pleasure. I think it's the first time we've shared a stage together, so it's an honor in that regard as well. So have a lot of respect for a lot of the fantastic work that you're doing in the Kahela Policy Forum as well. So it's great to be on with you. Look, it's hard to underscore, I think, the full impact of this move. In a region, I think, an area where we're short of good news. This is something that I think there's this tremendous and sincere sense of enthusiasm and support and hope, which, just think underscores that this is no normal country. The mere idea of a possible normalization in an Arab country has, literally, I think, brought almost a sense of euphoria amongst so many in Israel, certainly the pro-Israel community. Within days of the announcement, I was involved in a Zoom meeting with a group of young Emiratis and that's something that came off Twitter. And it's incredible to see this because for me, sort of the real difference between the peace we have with the Jordanians and the Egyptians, which is very much what I would call a cold peace, a peace that seems to be imposed, from the political leadership. This seems to be very much, going the direction of a people to people, far stronger, far more powerful. We're seeing, everything from flights to phone calls, direct phone calls to Zoom sessions. One of the groups I've heard that they're now going to start Hebrew Ulpan lessons for people in the Gulf. Little things like that, sort of these little bonds between people to people level is something that long term is far more, I think, powerful. What this has done, I think, in a big picture, is that it's changed the paradigm completely in terms of how we look at the Middle East and how we look at the peace process. I think what it's done is in two things, especially. One is it's removed the whole land for peace theory, and we now have a peace for peace theory, peace for peace plan, which is far more powerful. It has taken the Palestinians completely out of the equation. Abba Eban, the former legendary Israeli diplomat, said the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And boy, did they miss an opportunity here when what was offered to them by the Trump administration in the beginning. And now they have lost their two main sources of what I would call extortion of Israel, of the Jewish state. One being that what this deal has shown is that we can have normalization with Arab countries without advancement or resolution of the Palestinian issue. It has de facto normalized our control over Judea and Samaria, as long as we do not go further, at least for this stage. And three, I think what it's also shown is that, or what it's taken away is from the Palestinians, is that the threat of annexation or the threat of sanctions against Israel, if we proceed with sovereignty, especially from the Europeans. So now the Palestinians will have pressure upon them from the other Arab and Gulf countries who are growing increasingly weary and tired of their intransigence. There'll be additional pressure from the US to get the Palestinians to move. So there'll have to be some kind of shift from them in terms of where they go. At the end of the day, I think this was simply, to use a quote from The Godfather, an offer that Netanyahu just could not refuse. Domestically, he was in a very tough situation with Corona, COVID-19, 20% of the country was unemployed. He has an offer on the table from the UAE with further offers potentially and likely from other Arab and Gulf states for normalization to change, the equation of how we look at the Middle East. So I don't think this is something that he was going to say no to. Kushner is very much looking at the bigger picture here. He wants the Arab states involved in his broad Middle East peace plan. So I don't think he'll be, they'll be green lighting this anytime soon. And of course, the closer we come to the US elections, the less likely it's going to happen. And if Biden should win, then obviously this will be off the table completely. But for the time being, I think it's more a pause. The question is, for how long? That's something we'll have to see if Trump gets into a second term, if it's something that will be renewed. But for now, I think there's a lot of energy here, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of hope, and how we move forward, we'll have to see in the coming weeks and months, especially I think as other Arab and Gulf states will warm up and formalize relations as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Professor, curious for your thoughts on where this fits in as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here with all of you. Really impressed at the size of the audience. It's great to be here with Arsen. I have to say, we're in the same country, so it's hot here too. But I was very anxious for dressing down because I was going to be on with Arsen, who's the best dressed man in the business. And now I feel like I have a license. I'm
wearing flip-flops, Eugene, so that's okay underneath this.
Yeah, we never ask what's below the screen. I teach enough of these Zooms to to know. So the the deal with the UAE is a wonderful thing, and it's a great deal, and one can't question its importance. I want to start from the other side, and what one can question is the price. If it is the case that this came at the cost of applying Israeli law to Judea and Samaria, what some people call annexation, a term that I think is legally inaccurate, then it was a price that is almost certainly too high to pay, because diplomatic relations come and go. They're off and on, but the application of Israeli law is something that once done is almost impossible to reverse. And certainly the application of Israeli law to Jerusalem in 1967 has yielded dividends that we continue to reap today, that really make it would be unthinkable to imagine Israel without it. Now the question that's on the question of the price, but on the other hand, it's not clear that the application of Israeli law was going to happen. Perhaps out of some kind of lack of willingness on the Trump administration, perhaps because of timidity on the part of the Netanyahu administration, perhaps because of the strange kind of two-headed government in Israel, which makes anything impossible. So if it was likely not going to happen, then turning the possibility of it into the slim possibility of it into a win is making lemonade out of lemons is definitely a good idea. I think politically it's a classic Netanyahu maneuver. It avoids taking a risky proactive move like applying Israeli law that might rock the boat and cause him headaches, while at the same time being an extraordinary defensive move. As Arsen said, it's going to be very hard for those in Europe. I mean, they're going to try anyway, but it's going to be very hard for those in Europe who support cutting back economic ties with Israel because of the problems with the Palestinians, boycotts of Israel, to push this in the face of this kind of news. So today we see the United Arab Emirates has undone its Israel boycott law at a time when some European countries are trying to implement such laws, like in Ireland. So it's going to be very strange. The Europeans, I think, are going to find themselves in a very weird position when they are pushing for a boycott to defend Arab rights that is, and the Arabs are going in the opposite direction. This is going to make, I think, Israel boycotts a very hard sell. Now that doesn't mean they're not going to try. I think it's instructive that the most critical statement against the Abraham Accords came not from anywhere in the Arab world, but from the foreign minister of Luxembourg, who seemed displeased with it. But it really it creates a situation in which it's a defensive move in that it's a bet hedger. If the application of Israeli law were possible under the Trump administration, it would be extraordinary to lock that in. But if it were going to ultimately not be possible, this puts Netanyahu and Israel in a much better defensive position in the face of a potential Biden administration, because it's going to be very hard, even with under pressure from progressives, to be pushing for more restrictive measures on Israel at a time when there's going to be Arab country after Arab country. I think the slow rollout of this makes sense. Opening ties, warming ties with Israel. It's going to really seem like spitting into the wind. I think another very important point is it shows that unless it's Arsen, when the predictions of Middle East experts who occupy many positions in Washington think tanks, in the pages of the New York Times, have an extraordinary ability to be really wrong all the time about many major questions. It was one of the articles of faith amongst Middle East experts. Like if you disagreed with this, you by definition were not a Middle East expert. That the path to normalization with the Arabs read through the resolution of the Palestinian question, which meant the concession to whatever the Palestinian demands were. This was, a view very much popularized by Thomas Friedman, but accepted as common sense by everyone. Along with the idea that no US president would move the embassy to Jerusalem, that no country would follow the US in recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, that no country would recognize the Golan Heights and occupied territory as part of Israel, and that all of those things would blow up the Middle East, all those things were wrong, and I really wish I were a Middle East expert, because it seems like the job with the best job security against failure. But all these things actually have something in common. The same reason that President Trump could recognize the Golan without the Middle East exploding, could move the embassy without the Middle East exploding, is really the same reason that he could broker this historic deal. There's really one word for that, which is the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which transformed the Middle East by giving Western backing to an Iranian nuclear program. And already at the time, there had been warm ties, there had been quiet business ties and business between the Gulf states, the Emirati states, which are not particularly fanatical, and Israel. The Emiratis are practical, there are business advantages to this, but this turned it into an existential question, because Iran is an existential threat to the Gulf states. It's not just like a problem, it is a threat to their existence. It is involved in a land war with the UAE and Saudi Arabia in Yemen. By strengthening Iran, the Obama administration catalyzed processes that were already in the works. That is to say, the Emiratis were already tired of Palestinian intransigence. They were already attracted to and sort of getting interested to the proximity of this high-tech powerhouse that they could do business with. But this really put it on steroids because it made the collaboration between these countries all the more important. And it really underscores how much interests are at the forefront of Middle East politics. So that's one reaction.
Interesting. So, I mean, you're describing, I think we've read this elsewhere, that I think Iran in many respects, was the catalyst, or at least a major factor pushing some of these Gulf states towards Israel. And you talked about this concept of linkage. When I want to ask Arsen about this, where you have this, I think, this common, I wouldn't say trope, but this sort of common belief in diplomatic circles from Washington to Brussels to Ottawa over many years that the path to Middle East peace ran through Israel and ran through the Palestinian territories. And I'm wondering, Arsen, to sort of pivot back to you, why do you think this has changed? And why do you think it's changed? And two, what was the rationale behind this this belief in the first place? Why did diplomats, educated, thoughtful, worldly diplomats, think that the key to unlocking peace in the Middle East was between Israel and the Palestinians, when we've seen that hasn't been the case, not just with the UAE, but with Chad, with sort of more hidden, the worst kept secrets of Israel's relationships with other Gulf states? Curious for your thoughts.
Well, simply perhaps because they weren't as thoughtful as you suggest they may have been. It's interesting seeing a lot of people, for example, in the Obama administration, coming out with a very sort of lukewarm reaction to this. Your past negotiators, your past sort of so-called experts and think tank policy gurus. You've also seen a number of progressive organizations coming out with also, if not critical, but lukewarm responses. I think on the one hand, perhaps there's a sense of jealousy of the fact that here comes Kushner and Avi Berkovich, who have been in this position for less than a term and have managed to bring a tangible peace deal between Israel and an Arab country, our first in like 26 years and the first with a Gulf country. But it also, I think, perhaps underscores with some of these other organizations that have come with a bit more of a cold-ish response, that perhaps they weren't so interested in peace after all, as much as they've led us to believe, because this is a bona fide peace agreement, not just on a government-to-government level, but on people-to-people level. But to go deeper, if you want to look at sort of the ultimate difference, it's quite simply, I think, Donald Trump. Love him or loathe him, he is the one that has come in here and shaken things up. The administration essentially said, they've taken Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But we've been stuck in this quagmire, and they've tried to think outside the box. What will make things move? And I think they hit the nail on the coffin in, understanding the level of perhaps growing intransigence in the Arab and the Gulf world with the Palestinians on their rejectionism. They have understood, as Eugene has referenced, the danger of Iran. Iran is not only an existential threat to the state of Israel, but it's also a very real security threat to the Gulf and the Arab countries, and which is why you're seeing now, other Arab and Gulf countries expressing support for this deal. I haven't seen, apart from Iran and Turkey, which is in a separate league of its own, any other Arab and Gulf country expressing, criticism of this deal. But the administration, at the end of the day, they want big, broad peace. Trump wants the deal. He wants to clinch the deal. He's brought Kushner in, and Kushner wants to see broader peace in the Middle East. So I think they've hit the nail on the coffin in recognizing that peace will come not through Ramallah, but peace will come through Abu Dhabi, peace will come through Khartoum, peace will come through the Arab and the Gulf countries. But what Netanyahu has done as well in this, and that's something that, with utmost respect, Eugene, I'm going to disagree with you just a little bit, in that I think that this wasn't, on the contrary, this wasn't a defensive move from Netanyahu, who I agree is a very conservative leader and, not wanting to rock the boat. But I think this was in very ways also a very not offensive move, but a proactive move, shifting the goalposts, shifting the paradigm. And as he said just today, that they have removed the Palestinian veto power over peace and over our relations with the Arab states. Because by removing the two things that matter most to them, one, the threat, the two bargaining chips that held over us, the threat of normalization in other Arab countries will not progress without the Palestinian issue, and the threat of sanctions from Europe and the international community should we go ahead with the sovereignty move. By removing those two factors from the equation, it removes the Palestinian veto power, as Netanyahu alluded to in his press conference with Kushner and O'Brien, the National Security Advisor. And I think it has put Israel on the front foot in what else we can achieve with the Arab and Gulf countries, and by further sidelining the Palestinians.
Right. Okay, excellent. I want to bring this back. I know that we had this topic, and I think about 3 weeks ago, both our esteemed speakers emailed us and had said, are we still doing this talk, right? Everything's so different now with the UAE, and I think this is a good time. Of course, we wanted to talk about, this UAE deal and how it fits in because of talk about where this fits into Israel's legal rights. I want to pivot back for a while to Israel's legal rights to Judea and Samaria. And of course, this is, I want to go back to Professor Kontorovich for this. And, particularly with the media angle here, you corrected me, and I appreciate in the beginning, about the difference between applying Israeli sovereignty and annexation. So just very briefly, as I'm sure nobody here needs to be, told, that when you open up the newspaper or read anything, it's sort of a given, I think in Western mainstream media, that we're reading that, this land is occupied, 1967 and so on and so forth. 1967 borders is always my favorite. So, Professor, maybe you can give us sort of a very brief, for those who are not familiar with your work or familiar with your name, But can you give us sort of a very brief understanding in terms of what constitutes Israel's legal rights, to Judea and Samaria specifically, the land that is, commonly called occupied territory. And, and then I want to pivot back to sort of a follow-up question with Arsen, but, Professor, maybe you can give us a, quick and dirty understanding what exactly constitutes, because I think many of us inherently know that Israel didn't come and steal the land. There's historical, there's legal rights, but, I think we often struggle articulating that in layman's terms.
Okay, so it's not a quick. It's not a quick answer. I wrote a 70-page article about it, but let's start with this term annexation and why it's not a correct term. Annexation has a very clear definition in international law. You could look it up in the Oxford Encyclopedia of International Law. Annexation is when one country takes the territory of another country and makes it its own. When in a war or by force, one country takes the territory of another country and makes it its own. And what's crucial about Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, is that in any view, not just the view of the United States, but also the view of Europe, the view of Ottawa, this land does not belong to another country, thus it cannot be annexed. You can only annex territory of a foreign country, and that is what it is not. So whatever one might call it, it's not annexation. What is the status? What is the status of this land? It is most certainly not occupied, and it's not occupied for many reasons. One reason is you cannot, so occupation is also when one country puts the territory of another under its administration in wartime. But Israel has the strongest claim to sovereignty over this area. And that is because, so why does Israel have a claim to Tel Aviv? Why does Israel have a claim to Haifa? Why does Israel have a claim to any of these places? All of these places, so the way countries establish their borders, when new countries are created, borders are not established by historical or ancient title. Borders are not established by demographics, because all those factors are too complicated to be workable border rules. When a new country is created anywhere in the world, in modern times, the rule is very simple for its borders. The borders are the borders of the last top-level administrative unit in that territory. So what is a top-level administrative unit? Depends where you are. In the Soviet Union, it's a Soviet Socialist Republic. In Canada, it is a province. In the United States, it's a state. So when a mandatory territory becomes an independent country, its borders are the borders of that mandatory territory, because that is itself a top-level administrative unit. That is why, for example, we were talking about Lebanon. That's why Lebanon has the borders that it has. Not because the borders are a way of putting together homogenous people, ethnically or religiously homogenous people. It most certainly is not that. It's the opposite of that. That's why Syria has the borders that it has. Not because they said, oh, let's put like all the people who are like ethnically similar together. As a matter of fact, it does exactly the opposite of that. But those were the borders of the League of Nations mandatory administrative units beforehand, and that is the only way in which one can establish borders, because otherwise there is no certainty over borders. So when Israel was created under the normal rules of international law, which I completely agree do not apply to Israel are not conventionally applied to Israel, but that does not change the fact that they are the rules. Israel would have the borders of the mandatory Palestine, and when it was invaded by Jordan, the occupied Palestinian territory, it most accurately refers to the Jordanian occupation of mandatory Palestinian territory from 1949 to 1967. In other words, you cannot occupy what you have a legal title to. By the way, even if you could occupy, even if somehow Israel did not have a title, even if Israel did become an occupier in 1967, the signing of a peace treaty in 1994 would end all states of occupation. Under Geneva Conventions, there is no example anywhere in the world of an occupation lasting beyond a full peace. And indeed, when the United States State Department sort of set the tone for much of the international community and concluded in a famous and now repudiated memo in 1977 that Israel was an occupying power in the West Bank, they also said, of course, if Israel were to make peace with Jordan, it would no longer be an occupying power. Nobody remembers that sentence. But in any case, the view of the United States now clearly is that Israel is not an occupying power in this territory. And that applies both to the question of the legal claims to the land and also to the characterization of this as occupation.
Thank you, Professor. I want to pivot back to Arsen. Here's an interesting, concept, and of course, as the professor just mentioned, that what is truth in international law, and I think that in many respects, Professor Kontorovich wrote the book literally on this. Isn't necessarily what's articulated or reflected in the media, and I think that it's very hard for people to, like I said, who are supportive even to understand the minutia of it, but particularly people who are uninformed, the vast majority of people for whom they have their own lives, and Israel is not a topic front and center for them, understanding the details here. But there's always one dynamic which has always been, noteworthy for me. It's that you have on one hand, the Palestinian, if you will, spokespeople with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, back in the day, or the Palestinian Authority now, expressing vehemently and unapologetically, it's our land, it's our land, it's our land. And then you have Israel seeming to, again, I can't, maybe there's been a different government since we started the webinar, I don't know, but it seems that there's always different, messages coming from Israel where it's our land, but it's also, well, let's negotiate, land for peace. And I think if you are expressing, my own view, if you're sort of taking a look here, you see one side claiming it as ours and the other side saying, well, it's sort of yours, it's sort of ours, let's talk. One can almost understand why there's a bit of a mixed message coming from Jerusalem. And, certainly as reflected in the media. And I'm wondering, Arsen, in your view, how has Israel articulated its legal rights to this land? And how has that changed in recent years? And why has it been so reticent to articulate that right in the same way that the Palestinians have?
First of all, don't scare me by suggesting there could have been another election since we came online. I'm very quickly checking my phone to see it's not coming on, because even though we had finally an agreement to extend the deadline on the budget for 100 days or so until Hanukkah, you never know what can happen in 40 minutes. So let's cool things down just a little bit, please. We've had enough of that. Look, to answer your question, I think there's a large sense of responsibility on us, in that those on us in the pro-Israel community, as well as in the official State of Israel apparatus, that have, to be honest, dropped the ball. The Palestinians are very good at making their case. Truthfully or not, you know what their position is. You know what they claim to, what they say. They want the 67 borders. They want the Jerusalem split, return of refugees. They are the victims. They know, everyone knows what their case is. They are claiming that they are victims, that they are occupied people, and so on. We have for a long time, and certainly when it's come to Judea and Samaria, failed quite simply to make the case for our rights to the land on a legal basis, on a moral basis, and on a historical basis. Because for too long, we have said that we are there. We have made the argument from a security perspective lens. And that is not a very effective argument, certainly not in the court of public opinion. And when we have certainly a government which has at least half a dozen different parties, from left to right, and even those in the right from different spectrum, providing different positions, some saying gung-ho, yes, this is our land, others saying, well, maybe, but only if we have the approval of the United States, others saying, no, not now, others are saying that we should not be occupiers, and so on. We have provided a whole range of multiple different messages, and that makes our case very difficult to make. And those that are trying to monitor what is happening, those that are trying to interpret what is happening, they don't know what is Israel's position. What is Netanyahu's position? One day, for example, he's saying that he's going to apply sovereignty, and the next he's saying he's putting it on hold. What is it? But at the end of the day, what really I think it comes down to is that we have failed in the war of narratives. Everyone knows what the Palestinian narrative is. It's not enough for us to say that our narrative is is a rebuttal of the Palestinian narrative against us. We need to be out there, and we need to be saying what it is that we stand for, why it is that we as a Jewish people, as a Jewish nation, have the legal, biblical, historical, moral rights to Judea and Samaria. We need to be out there not only defending our rights, but out there proactively exerting and using our position to try and stand up for what are our rights, and not simply refuting what the Palestinian position is. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, I think we have lost, or we are losing, to be more precise, the war of narratives. I hope that's something we can regain, and that's not only a responsibility that falls on the State of Israel and official government apparatuses, but also those in the pro-Israel community and those that are out there making the case for the Jewish state on campus, in the media, in churches, and so on, to try and explain, as Eugene did so eloquently, why it is that we are not occupiers in our own territory, and why it is that we have not just the legal but moral rights to this land.
So you touched on something there, the distinction, or I shouldn't say the distinction, but sort of both legal and moral rights. From what I've seen as well, I mean, obviously there's a lot of messages that are given contrary to Israel, but one of them that I've seen is, listen, it doesn't matter who's right, who has the legal title anymore. There are millions of people who live here and millions of people who live here. Let's just deal with the realities on the ground. I want to ask you both, in terms of, because Arsen, you talked about, let's reframe the message. And Professor Kontorovich talked about, this is the state of Israel, the Jewish people's legal right, legal title to the land. And just in the home stretch now, I wanted to just open up to both of you in terms of how you would see that on macro sense that these rights should be articulated, like I said, because I think for many people, they say, well, truth before solutions, right? Let's talk about who actually owns the land. And then others say, it doesn't matter who owns it because this is the reality now. Squatters' rights, you might say. So, like I said, while we wrap up here, I want to end asking both of you, for a prescription, in terms of, what you would ask if you were consulting, the government, what the message that they should be pivoting to is on a macro level.
The government wouldn't want us consulting them.
We've tried.
Yeah, I think, first of all, clarity and consistency are important. It's a basic of communication, but at the same time, to be fair, the Palestinians have an inherent advantage in this because they are they are a closed autocracy, and Israel is a democracy. And it's, democracies are about lots of different messages. It's hard for a democracy to stay on message, and a Jewish democracy, I would say, even more so. That said, and I think Netanyahu very often says, we are not occupiers, we are not strangers here, this is not a foreign country for us. He says that, but nobody's listening. I think it's important to go on the offensive. Instead of we are not and like why we're not wrong, I think it's important to talk about. I think we can learn a great deal from the successful campaign, the partially successful campaign to demonize Israel, because whoever is having to explain themselves is by definition on the back foot. Right? As I say, if you're explaining, you're losing. It would be helpful to talk about Palestinian apartheid. The Palestinians have made an issue of settlements. It's important to rephrase that in the correct moral language, which is the claim that Jews should not live in Judea and Samaria really means that the places that Jordan completely ethnically cleansed Jews from in 1949 must remain Judenrein forever. The Palestinians have a unique demand that has never been made by any national liberation movement before of a Judenrein state, a state pre-cleansed of an ethnic minority. They want Israel not just to turn over the keys, but to clean out the undesirable Jews first. And they want to create the world's only officially Jewish, that is to say, there's places where Jews can't go, right? Mecca and Medina, but there's not officially Jew-free zones. They want Israel to be in charge of administering a Jew-free zone in the Jewish historical homeland, and that's perverse. And that is why they talk about it in terms of international law. That's why they rather say the Geneva Conventions rather than the maintenance of a Jew-free zone in areas rendered Jew-free by Jordan in 1949. And when you put it in those terms, I think, then you're harnessing the moral argument. That's all.
Thank you very much. Arsen, any final thoughts from you?
Well, first, I agree with everything that Eugene just said, especially the point that we need to shift from a defensive standpoint to an offensive one. We'll always need to be putting out fires and responding to the liars and the delegitimizers and the demonizers, but we also need to be out there on the front foot. We need to be out there making a proactive case. We need to be reversing the equation instead of, for example, lawfare being applied to us as it is at the ICC, reversing it and applying it to the Palestinians and their enablers and their supporters. But one thing I would add is that, I think it's undeniable that the law is on our side. But then again, we know that groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and Turkey and Iran and the like, they don't care about the Geneva Conventions or the UN resolutions or the norms of international law. It doesn't matter. Those that advocate BDS and the destruction of Israel, they don't care about international law either. So in as much as we do have a legal case, I think we also need to make an emotive case. We also need to make, as I said, it's also a war of narratives, which we need to be mindful. So we need to make also an emotional connection as well. Not just a purely factual base, because that's something that hasn't been working so far. So we need to, the law is on our side, the facts are on our side, we need to use that, but we also need to apply it in a way that we can convey it to the person on the street as well. I think that's important. But I'll also add, we need to be highlighting also the, what I think is this really vehement double standard in application of international law when we're talking about, occupation. Okay, well, why are we not talking about Turkey? Why are we not talking about the Russians? Why are we not talking about what's happening in Morocco, the Sahara? The only other thing I would add, and perhaps it's something a bit more of a tangent in terms of making the case for Israel, it's not only about the message, it's also about the messenger. Mm. And sometimes, there are others that can make the case far better for us. If we're talking about Israel as democracy, looking at minorities and our strategic allies from different multi-faith groups, when we're looking at this really dramatic shift in regional geopolitics and Israel's, I don't buy into the fact that Israel is isolated. I think we have a lot of allies, whether it's growing in the Gulf country, in parts of Europe, look at Austria, Czech Republic, Hungary, the Central Eastern European nations. I think we need to find a way to also work with them and try and amplify their ability to help support us and make the case for us in international arenas and in their own legislatures. So be able to use them as allies also to help make the very case that we are trying to make ourselves.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for what has been certainly an enlightening conversation, and I'm sure I can speak for all our participants who would say that as well. This program has been recorded, so hopefully will be up on YouTube in the next day and a half. But again, I want to thank Eugene Kontorovich and Arsen Ostrovsky for your time, for your thoughts, and no doubt we will see what happens next. And again, I encourage everybody to follow them on social media. And thank you so much. Mark your calendars. Our next webinar will be Thursday evening, October 1st. And I don't want to give more than that, but no doubt it will be just as enthralling as today. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.